I'm Alex Hodges. I am the Graduate School of Education's new librarian here at the library. I'm barely 1 month into my position, and I'm delighted to be here today for several reasons. First, as of last month, I was living in Washington, D.C. But second, the chance to celebrate the scholarship made possible by the Chall Endowment, which was established in 1999 to honor Dr. Jeanne Chall, a leading expert in reading research and instruction. As many of you know, she was a psychologist, a teacher, a writer, and lastly, a professor emerita at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. An amazing life of accomplishment. The endowment ensures that Dr. Chall's legacy of active engagement in reading research is perpetuated here at HGSE and in the wider education community. My third reason I'm delighted to be here is the opportunity to meet all of you. And in one way or another, you've been inspired by Dr. Chall's reading research to be here tonight. And we have quite a good crowd, so I'm very grateful. Through you and your interests in reading and literacy development, I look forward to developing a deeper connection to Dr. Chall's legacy. Myself, as a founding curator of an academic critical literacy collection at American University in Washington, D.C., I collected both children's and adult literature for a teacher education curriculum. Those students, as student teachers, lacked adequate access to books for their students in the DC public schools. So rightly, I think I found a really good place to develop my academic career. I want to mention a few appreciations. First, I want to thank the members of the Chall Endowment Advisory Board from HGSE, Pamela Mason, Jimmy Kim, Meredith Rowe, and Rebecca Martin, who served as the interim chair and master organizer before my arrival. Tonight she is in Hawaii celebrating. From Boston College, Patrick Proctor. From NYU, Catherine Stahl. And from Stonehill College, Margaret Pierce. Additionally, I'd like to recognize Jody Bennett-Smith, Roger Falcon, Mayanne Kravashi, and Carla Lilvit, as well as all the support staff who've made us comfortable here tonight. Those chairs are coming right in now. Let's give them a hand. Some very quick housekeeping. Tonight's lecture will be followed by audience Q&A, and then our Chall Awards presentation. After the awards presentation, I invite you all to partake in our reception from 7 to 8 p.m. The reception will magically appear. Maybe. And that was to demonstrate that the walls behind us will open up and invite us to imbibe and enjoy some food and drink. Also, I want to take the opportunity to welcome you to visit the Gutman Library Special Collections, which are also housed here on this ground level of Gutman Library. And we do have a pop-up exhibit of some of the Jeanne Chall collection that was gifted to us. I hope you'll take advantage of looking at it, but I do ask you, as the librarian, I'm not a very good librarian rules, but forgive this, if you are drinking and eating, please do so on this side of the conference center, but once you get into the reading room, please no food or drink there. So, now to introduce our main guest of honor, Dr. Margaret McKeown. Dr. McKeown earned her PhD from the University of Pittsburgh. She began her career teaching reading and language arts at the elementary school level. She is now senior scientist at the University of Pittsburgh's Learning Research and Development Center and clinical professor in the School of Education. Her work involves applying theory and cognitive research to practical current problems that classroom teachers and their students face. Dr. McKeown's research at LRDC, in collaboration with Isabel Beck, has included two major emphases: the study of vocabulary and its effects on reading comprehension, and the study of students' comprehension from school texts. Dr. McKeown's work in vocabulary has focused on the effects of vocabulary knowledge on reading comprehension through the implementation of vocabulary interventions designed to help students build rich semantic concepts. She has published extensively in outlets for both research and practitioner audiences. She's been recognized with the Outstanding Dissertation Award from the International Reading Association, a National Academy of Education Spencer Postdoctoral Fellowship, membership in the Reading Hall of Fame, induction as an AERA Fellow, and the Notable Researcher Award from AERA's Vocabulary Special Interest Group. Her book, Bringing Words to Life, was recently listed in an online article in The Guardian entitled 10 Books Every Teacher Should Read, and I quote, as simply the best book on teaching vocabulary. Dr. McKeown has served as AERA Vice President for Division C and is editor of AERA's research journal, AERJ, and most recently at AERA's Governing Council as member at large from 2013 to 2016. She served on the National Assessment of Education Progress, NAEP, a panel that developed the current 2009 framework for the reading assessment and led the design and development of the vocabulary portion of the assessment. I warmly welcome Dr. McKeown to Harvard Graduate School of Education. Her lecture tonight, Stealth Aspects of Vocabulary Learning.
I guess this is on. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I'm very honored to be here to give this talk tonight, and so happy to see so many old friends here. It's really been fun so far. I'm especially delighted to be part of honoring Jeanne Chall. Jeanne was an amazing and dogged researcher, teacher, mentor, and colleague, and human being. And I really appreciate this opportunity to both to honor and recognize and help continue her legacy. So I appreciate that. The title of my talk is Stealth Aspects of Vocabulary Learning, and my goal is that by the end of the talk you'll understand what I mean by that. And notice I do have my email up here, and I really do that as a reason. I love to communicate with people over email, so feel free to do that if a question occurs to you afterwards that you don't want to ask to me. I'm going to start with a little bit of a historical perspective. There's been a great deal of work on the link between vocabulary knowledge and reading comprehension, going back to factor analytic studies that showed very high correlation between a person's vocabulary knowledge and their ability to comprehend what they've read. Now, particularly this early work kind of produced the allure that this vocabulary, that comprehension could be addressed through vocabulary and through what was tested about vocabulary at that time, which was mostly definitional knowledge. So what happened is that early work on vocabulary instruction mainly focused on definitions. So getting kids to look up words in the dictionary, studying words, studying definitions of words, then they were tested on definitions of words. And guess what? They learned the definitions of words, but it didn't influence comprehension. So that really didn't work out quite the way as we had hoped. From about the early 1980s, researchers began to upgrade the kinds of instructional elements that were in vocabulary interventions, hypothesizing that there may be some other aspects of vocabulary that were needed in order to promote that link from vocabulary knowledge to reading comprehension. And the field began to coalesce around a set of components that seemed to characterize the more effective instruction. And these were providing a student with definitional and contextual knowledge, giving students multiple encounters with words across various contexts, and providing interactions around words that got them actively engaged in using the words. And this consensus grew that inclusion of those components seemed more likely to lead to comprehension effects. And these are some of the foundational studies that built that consensus. First of all, a couple of review articles, Mazinski and then the Stall and Fairbanks, which was a meta-analysis of interventions. The next 5 are all individual studies of vocabulary that had those components, that had some comprehension effects, and they're across grade levels, from 4th grade through high school. And then this set of components, this consensus, was again acknowledged in the National Reading Report in 2000. Since that time, there have been lots of other vocabulary studies, including ones by Tony Rousseau, Catherine Snow and her colleagues, that also use some version of these components, active learning, lots of contexts, and that research has been taken down as far as kindergarten and first grade with work by people like Michael Coyne. So that's been a kind of steady part of what we've learned about vocabulary instruction. Over the past decade or so, theoretical perspectives have begun to be fleshed out that address more precisely what is word knowledge and how do we learn words. And I'm going to take you through some of those. One was from Bill Nagy and Judy Scott, who did work on vocabulary acquisition processes. And their major focus was recognizing the complexity of word knowledge. And in talking about word knowledge complexity, they identified a number of components that were involved that make word knowledge complex. One is incrementality, the idea that you incrementally learn and understand what a word means. You don't learn it all at once. Polysemy, that word meanings are flexible. A word doesn't mean the same thing every time you meet it in context. And those differences can be dramatic or they can be much more subtle, but they really affect how well you're going to do with that context. Multidimensionality, the idea that each word has a whole set of dimensions from spoken and written forms, grammatical forms. Words have register. Beyond conceptual meaning, there are things like collocational behavior. What other words does the word typically appear with? And associations to other words. What words are similar, get used in the same, under the same circumstances or in the same contexts. Chuck Perfetti introduced the lexical quality hypothesis, and he talks about lexical quality as the degree to which form, so orthographic and phonological, and meaning, semantic features of a word, come to be represented mentally for a learner in ways that are both precise and flexible. So precise and flexible are key points. Your representation of a word has to have precision, so that every time you come upon that word, you hear it or read it, you know that it's that particular word. But flexibility comes in as well, because you have to be flexible in knowing that the meaning of that can shift depending on context. Even pronunciation can shift depending on if the part of speech of the word, or if it has affixes attached to it, that things change. So lexical quality also assumes that word knowledge is acquired over time through repeated experiences. And in talking about those experiences, Perfetti has focused on that each time you meet a word in a meaningful context, you take some features of that word away from that context. And over time, that you begin to build an abstract meaning for that word. So it's detached from those contexts, so you're not context bound anymore. And it's that abstraction that allows you to have flexibility, to be able to apply that word in different contexts, to understand different contexts in which you find the word used. A book that several colleagues and I just published this past summer was based on a conference about vocabulary assessment that brought together a lot of great thinking, we thought. And our focus in that work is the idea of a word learning burden. So we talk about information that you need to compile information on word meaning and also on generative patterns of language that go across words. So these include syntactic patterns, how words fit together into sentences, semantic patterns, how meanings are extended, that flexibility again, how meanings are extended through polysemy and through other kinds of devices of words. And then morphological patterns, the internal patterns of words, words that words get put together from pieces like affixes, root words, but also bound roots that don't stand on their own. And learning these generative patterns can be very important in supporting inferences, to resolve ambiguity that may come about because the way the word, again, the way the word is used changes over contexts. So there are these generative patterns, and then there's also knowledge of specific words, things like collocation, connotation, semantic category, constraints of use, all have to be pulled together for a learner to have the kind of effective vocabulary knowledge that can be applied to comprehension. So looking across those different theoretical descriptions, the way I describe the kind of Cliff Notes version of word learning is that exposures. You just need lots and lots of exposures to learn a word. What you need to learn is multifaceted. You have to learn specific things about words, but you also have to learn things about words in general. And with that information, as you compile that information, you're really building a mental network of connections among words. So words are connected to other words that may mean similar things. They're connected to experiences that you've had that fit that word, and that makes it easy for you to access a word meaning or whatever you need about a word very quickly. But it also affords that flexibility that you can pull from different pieces of your network that you need in to figure out comprehension. So what these theoretical perspectives remind us of is there's just a whole lot to be learned about words. There's some systematicity to how we use and manipulate words, but it's also somewhat unpredictable as far as what knowledge you need about particular words in order to be able to use them in comprehension. And again, comprehension is really the goal. The reason that we want students to accumulate vocabulary knowledge is so they can use it to comprehend, to learn, and to learn. So what kind of information is it that we need when we comprehend? What does it look like? So I have some examples up here. So for vanished, think about a couple of sentences with vanished in it. The plate of cookies vanished versus the family next door vanished. If you read in a text that the plate of cookies vanished, you probably wouldn't be worried about the cookies. You could probably figure out what happened. If you read in a story that the family next door vanished, that might be a little more ominous. You can hear the music, in the background. So it's those kinds of things you have to be able to pull about a word and figure out how is that applying to the context. Then take a word like trend, which I learned from doing a vocabulary program with adolescents, that trend means fashion. That's what they think it means. But even with that, just that sense of it, you see things like ads that say, wear the latest trends, and where can I buy the latest trends? But really, you can't buy a trend. You can't wear a trend. So even within just that sense of the word, there are lots of complications. Let alone if you read about a trend in politics, it's not what politicians are wearing. So there's just a lot of knowledge about words that we have to kind of marshal our forces and understand them before they're going to help us in comprehension. So how can we support this kind of flexibility with word meaning with students? And I think that there's some components of strong vocabulary interventions and of circumstances of natural learning, when we just learn words on our own, that don't get enough notice, that are present in the interventions, but that don't get featured and they don't get measured. And those are kind of the stealth aspects that I want to be concerned with. So, for example, when Isabel Beck and I first developed a vocabulary program for fourth graders, we did things like, we threw at them things like, can you use eavesdrop and gregarious in a sentence? And I can remember one kid saying, oh, yeah, because if someone reports you for talking, they're eavesdropping and you're gregarious. That's flexibility, that's good. And then we'd say, can a tyrant be a miser? Now, these words the kids had already been introduced to and learned something about. Well, can a tyrant be a miser? And I can remember this little boy going, oh, no, because a tyrant is a cruel ruler, and a miser is somebody who's greedy with money. And then he stopped and went, oh, but you could have a cruel ruler who was greedy with money. So at that moment, the connections began to form. Those two words were no longer isolated little pieces that existed on their own, but he began to see the connections. And that's the kind of thinking I think we really need kids to do if they're going to have this kind of effective vocabulary knowledge they can apply to all the new contexts that they meet. And notice that we weren't deliberately trying to teach kids a relationship between eavesdrop and gregarious. That's not what was important. What was important is the kind of thinking that needed to go into providing an answer to that question. So thinking again about the three components that there's a consensus about that should be present in instruction: contextual and definitional information, multiple encounters, interactions for active engagement. So drilling down a little further, this idea of interactions, I think the kind of active engagement we need for kids is not just responding. A lot of times we think it's just, well, if the kid's doing something like giving a sentence with a word in, or filling in a fill in the blank, a closed sentence with their vocabulary words, that's active. Well, that's a start, but I don't think it's enough. I think we really we need to get kids explaining what they think a word means or how it fits, discussing, engaging in, does this word fit here? What could you do with this word there? And connecting. We need to give kids things that are a little off kilter. So you say to them, what's the connection between eavesdrop and gregarious? And they have to go, eavesdrop and gregarious. It's not something that they have down pat, like some two words that would be synonyms and easily explained. We want to make them go, oh, and have to dig into the features of words before they can respond. So I want to show you some instructional activities that we've used in some programs. So the idea of word associations, often that's done as just synonyms. Find the synonyms, match the synonyms. And we thought we needed to take it up a notch. So what we came up with was a setup we called overheard conversations. So imagine, we'd say to the kids, you're walking along the street and you're overhearing just little bits of conversation. And actually, it's much easier to do nowadays because you can say, imagine everybody's on their phone and you can hear just one side of the conversation. And then we'd give them some words that they'd been working with. And so for this one, we'd say, okay, for tedious, extravagant, and pretentious, tell me about these overheard conversations. So I spent all my allowance for 6 months on that video game. What do you think? What's it go with? Extravagant. That's what I'd say. I just can't face another minute of this. Hopefully you're not thinking that now. Or you're so lucky that I'm part of your team. Pretentious, yes. But then the important thing would be to ask why. Why does pretentious go with you're so lucky that I'm part of your team? We want kids to really explain those connections. What are the meaning elements that carry over? And we also encourage, these were left a little bit open because we wanted kids to be able to make arguments if they could. Maybe I'm going to say, I spent all my allowance for 6 months in that video game. Oh, I think that goes with pretentious. And we wouldn't say, you're wrong. We'd say, why? And if they could say, well, you'd have to have a really big allowance to buy one of these expensive video games. And so, you're kind of bragging about that. If they could do that, fine. They made the connection. They made their case. So it all is in the why. In fact, we started to notice in our very first program that we did with fourth graders that by kind of the middle of the year, some kids would actually try to do that. They would know what, the kind of the answer that we'd had in mind, and they would say something else. But it was so great because they sort of thought like, ha, I'm getting over on you. They were actually having to do a lot more thinking to make that kind of connection than the kind that we had envisioned. So that, keeping things a little open is really, really good. So then you can make it even messier. Provide a question that prompts students to generate a context or a situation like this. How might a cook a musician, a basketball player, a teacher, show that they're versatile, clever, industrious. So you've got kind of a 4x3, and all those cells can get filled in. And this is something that can be done, you can put groups together and say, okay, you be the cook group, answer that question for cook, you can be the musician group, and then after that's all over, you bring the groups together and you talk about it. So that kind of activity just has a huge richness of connections that it's creating for everybody. Lots of thinking. You can imagine the kids in groups saying, no, that wouldn't be versatile. Here's what would be versatile. Oh, no, here's a better example. All that kind of thinking that would surround an activity like this. And then it might even bring up things like, well, do examples of versatile and industrious look alike sometimes, and why? And so it's that kind of richness of thinking we're trying to push on. Going a little more directly for word relationships, I think forces kids to dig into the features of the words and have to think about them. So, do people with prestige prosper? And again, this would be words that you'd already introduced and done some work with a definition for and some other work with the words alone, and then you start putting them together. What might a meticulous person be vulnerable to? Could someone who's curious be a nuisance? And again, it's not that we want them to come away with a list of reasons that someone curious is a nuisance, but it's the thinking behind that, and it's the why. Why do you think that? That really does the work. So then turning now from instruction to assessment, how do we measure that? How do we know if we're giving kids that kind of flexibility that we're trying to develop? And typically, interventions or just vocabulary instruction that's done in classrooms, what happens is kids get tested on definitions. Still to this day, it's definitions that get tested. And then if something else is added, it's often a general comprehension test to see if vocabulary is affecting that. Well, most often kids will do very well in the definitions, and they won't do so well in improving comprehension. But even if they improved on both, what do we really know about what kids can do with the words they've learned? We really don't know about what their representations look like and how far they can extend if all we do is test definitions and then general comprehension. It leaves this wide gap in between that isn't helping us learn about what developing vocabulary knowledge looks like and where it goes, how well it can be used at different stages. So how else might we assess vocabulary learning that gets us out of that box? And over the years, a lot of people have worked on this issue. One of the earlier ones is John Reed's task supposed to be measuring depth of vocabulary, is what it was called. And then there have been other variants on that by other researchers. So for that, you start with a stimulus word, let's say powerful, and then you have to consider its relationship to a whole bunch of other words. So in this version of it, it says, look at the left box, indicate 1 to 3 words that can be synonyms of that word. And then look at the right-hand box and indicate 1 to 3 words that collocate with a stimulus word. Like, so would you have a powerful position? Is that something you hear about? A powerful engine, okay? A powerful repetition, probably not so much. A powerful price. Well, you could probably imagine what a powerful price might be, but it's not an expression we use. So that's the kind of thing that kind of measure is looking at. Another type of test explores how well learners can use knowledge to make sense of context. Because integrating a word meaning into a context is a key skill, a key feature of skilled comprehension. Chuck Perfetti and his lexical quality hypothesis and studies he's done to follow up on that have indicated that very strongly. So Isabel and I developed a measure of this, and what we did was take something that we thought were sort of neutral contexts or sort of contexts that might even seem to be going in the opposite direction of the word meaning, give them to kids and then ask them a question. So Sam was stunned when he looked into the doghouse. What do you think Sam saw? Or Mrs. Thomas was distraught when she looked at her garden. How did the garden look? Jimmy had to insist that Freddie go on the merry-go-round. What did Freddie think about the merry-go-round? So notice a couple things. We're not giving them a sentence and say, what does stunned mean? We're asking them about the implications of that sentence given the word that's there. Now, we use this in a couple studies. With fourth graders, we also used it with kindergartners. And in the studies, we had two groups of kids who had gotten this kind of rich interactive instruction, kids who had gotten a much more definition-based instruction. We found that the kids who had gotten the rich instruction were much better at answering these questions. The kids who had gotten the definition-based instruction were more likely to either give us the definition of the word, or like for insist. Jimmy had to insist. What did Freddie think about the merry-go-round? The kids who had gotten the rich instruction were more likely to say something like, he didn't like it. Maybe it went too fast. So they got it, that insist was a funny word in there. But the kids who had gotten the definition-based instruction were more likely to just give us a synonym or explain what the word insist meant, or to answer that based on the context alone. So they just think about merry-go-rounds and kids, and they'd say, oh, it was fun. They liked the merry-go-round. So that integration piece wasn't there. So what does that task ask learners to do? I want to take a little more analytic view of what you really have to do with that. So let's look at Mrs. Thomas. She was distraught when she looked at her garden. How did the garden look, we're saying? So if you have rich, flexible knowledge of this word distraught, there's lots of features and connections that you can call on. So you might start with something like, okay, I know when you're distraught you feel upset. It's a temporary emotion. It has an external cause. Those are probably among the connections in your network. And all this is happening really fast, like milliseconds. You're taking just milliseconds to do this as you see the word in the context. Then you might switch to considering the context and how that word fits in there. What would cause Mrs. Thomas to be distraught when looking at her garden? Because usually looking at a garden is something that's pleasant. So now you're having to accommodate this idea of being distraught into garden looking. So you're likely to now it pushes you to the idea that something must have happened. You're on the lookout for what happened. So maybe it is that a rabbit came and ate her garden. So what a learner needs to do in that task is really much more representative of what we have to do as readers when we're reading along in a text. We're meeting these words that are very semantically important to the context. We have to do that work to understand the situation. And it's those kinds of abilities that I'm saying are not captured by typical assessments, and that may not be an obvious feature of instruction as well. Again, it's that stealth thing. So what are some other kinds of items? What else might we assess to start to get an idea of what students' representations of words look like? Assessing for polysemy is an obvious one, because polysemy is a very important concept with all words, but especially as kids get to learning and needing more academic words. General academic words are famously polysemous because they go across disciplines and their meaning, their sense changes across those disciplines. So an assessment that taps polysemy might offer two sentences like the group expressed concern about the zoo's treatment of the animal. That letter is none of your concern. So two sentences that use the same word, and then ask students, what does it mean in each sentence? So for example, you might say for each sentence, choose the meaning of concern that best fits. Interest, worry, suspicion. And this is fairly subtle. I mean, those sentences are not that wide apart, but they do have different implications. Assessing for entailments. So what does it mean? What are the implications of a word in a certain context? So which are people most likely to do in a frenzy? In a frenzy. So if you're in a frenzy, could that be caused by having to leave a sinking ship? Probably. Would that be caused by cooking a feast? Well, hopefully not, unless you're just really not a very experienced cook, learning a new skill, writing thank you cards, less likely that you're going to do those in a frenzy. So what are the implications a word has for a context? Another type of item designed to assess understanding of context, given the use of a particular word, was the approach taken by NAEP from about 2009 when the framework changed. And Mary Beth is now frowning because she remembers the painful, the painful meetings of trying to get this approach to work. So what I have up here is a released item from NAEP. And so the idea was we wanted to test not definitions of words, not just meanings of words, not isolated words. So these were words that appeared within the passage that was part of the comprehension assessment. And we pulled out certain sentences and then designed an item around them. And the idea was that we wanted to test kind of like what the sentence meant, not just what the word meant. And we developed the distractors to be representative of misunderstandings that a student might have if they didn't know the word well. So this sentence, "the man's heart was touched," comes from a story, The Gardener and the Nightingale, in which a gardener has captured a nightingale and put her in a cage because she ate his roses. So she's now begging the gardener to be free, and his heart was touched. So does that mean that the man held the nightingale close to his heart, and we're trying to play on the idea of touched being a physical touch? That he liked listening to the nightingale? Now that was true of the context, but it's not what the man's heart was touched meant. And that's something you'll see that happens with students. If they don't know a word well and you ask them about a meaning of the word or a sentence, they'll pick something else from the context and think that's what the word means. The man felt convinced by the nightingale's words. That's the correct answer. It's not the meaning of touched, but that's what the sentence means within the context of the story, that he was convinced by the nightingale's plea to be free. And then put his hand over his heart. Again, that's a physical one. So at this point, what I'm suggesting is that vocabulary instruction needs to take much more seriously the notion of actively promoting thinking about words. And in assessment, we need to design ways to assess vocabulary knowledge that captures those kinds of abilities. And to appreciate the idea of stealth aspects of vocabulary, it's instructive to revisit Susan Carey's work about fast mapping. Because a lot of people who think, words can be learned easily will point to this research that Susan Carey did. Oh, there's fast mapping. Yes, there is fast mapping. What Carey found is that students or young children rather easily learn some features of a word that was being presented. It was a color term, and they began to learn it. But she also said that complete learning needed extended mapping. And she found that to be surprisingly slow, even with something like a color term that's pretty, you can just point to the color. And then she also pointed out that a learner may be working on 1,600 mappings at a time. So the words that you have in your vocabulary, particularly that's for younger students, you don't know them all to the same level, and you're working on them. You're working on a lot of them at the same time. So again, that's another piece of complexity that makes acquiring vocabulary knowledge tricky. So I think that the field is not adequately attending to the amount of effort that's needed for effective vocabulary learning. And this effort includes, again, not just learning words themselves, but characteristics for how words are used, how they interact with context. So in school, the most that it would be extravagant for teachers to spend 20 minutes a day on vocabulary. But that's a tiny bit of time in the classroom. What kids really need is to be immersed in words and language. So how can we provide that? One obvious way is rich conversations around books that focus on particular words and what they mean within a book. So this line is from The Magician's Nephew, which is the first book in the Chronicles of Narnia, C.S. Lewis Chronicles of Narnia. A character appears and says to Polly or complains that London is a beastly hole. And she says, "London isn't a hole," said Polly indignantly. So we've got this lovely word, indignantly, and it's clear in the context that Polly's not happy with what this person has said, so you're off to a good start that you can get some meaning from the context. It's also a morphologically rich opportunity because you've got indignantly that's got a prefix and a suffix, but in the middle is not a standalone word. You have dignant. So how do you deal with that? But getting kids to just think about that, those pieces, is really rich. And you can save the whole discussion of exactly what that word means for later, but just to get thoughts around that. And I think the idea of morphology with indignantly is that you don't have to close the door every time you open it. You can open the door to, is that a prefix? Is that a suffix? What's in the middle? And you don't have to explain it at that moment. And I think, again, too often teachers want to say that word means that and that word means that and just shut it down instead of letting it be messy, because language is a whole lot messier than that. And if we let kids be exposed to that messiness, I think it will engender a lot more thinking about language, but also have them feel better about, oh, I'm glad because sometimes I just can't figure stuff out. Right, you're not the only one. It's good if they know that. Conversations about words and books can also be more integral to the plot or characters in a book. For example, Littering Heights in the first chapter, Bronte introduces Heathcliff. And she uses words in that chapter, and not all of them, she doesn't use all of them to describe Heathcliff, but she uses words like solitary, misanthrope, reserved, inhospitable. So those are such rich words to begin to build a character portrait of Heathcliff. Later in the book, she uses the words alienate, estrange. So it's something that can be going on all through a book to build a portrait of a character, or of a place, or of a plot line even. We also need to provide opportunities or promote informal ways to provide opportunities to get more word-conscious talk into classrooms. It doesn't always have to be the meaning of the word that's talked about, just using and playing with the word. So, for example, I always tell teachers, just start off the day by saying something that's word-rich, like, today's Friday, let's get inspired. Or was anyone reluctant to get out of bed this morning? And take a few answers from kids. Or the idea of you've had a word that you're working on that kids are learning, then carry that forward, incorporate it into subsequent lessons. Maybe you've taught kids the word manipulative. Then you're reading a new story. You say, do you see any characters in this story as manipulative? And actually, we got this idea from a first grader. We were doing a real vocabulary program in kindergarten and first grade, and kids began to identify how a word that they'd used earlier could be used in a subsequent story. Exploring how words work. This could be done by using puns. Give kids some puns and ask them why they're funny. No matter how much you push the envelope, it will still be stationary. Why is that funny? Well, we've got stationary, which is a homophone. You've got push the envelope, this phrase that it's a play on the physical and the metaphorical meaning of it. Two silkworms had a race. They ended up in a tie. And my favorite, I wondered why the baseball kept getting bigger. Then it hit me. So and then the idea of it hit me, another phrase that has a metaphorical and a physical meaning. And that metaphorical and physical or metaphorical and literal meaning, that is a huge concept with all sorts of words, including academic words. Resort to pictures. So on the internet, you can find a million pictures, goofball pictures of lots of things, but pets particularly. These are just priceless. And then post it on the wall and challenge kids to come up with a caption that uses some word that they've been learning or some sophisticated word. So here for this, a couple I came up with was, Rex had an uncanny way of letting his owners he didn't want canned dog food. Or maybe Rex's hapless owner had forgotten to buy dog food again, and to give cats equal time. That's my own big fat cat, by the way. I think, so I'm imagining him saying, have you heard the latest trend is taking your cat on vacation? Or maybe my definitive answer is, you're not going anywhere. I'm parked on your suitcase.
So I kind of think of these as infecting kids with word worms. You know, like an earworm, they talk about a song that you can't get out of your head. I think we need to do that with words. We need to just push them out there, make it fun, so that kids just can't stop thinking about words, even when they get home, which is another point. That the reason we need to plant these word worms and to make it fun is that so that kids will really take this up on their own. Because again, there just isn't enough time in a classroom to give the kids all the input they need to effectively learn vocabulary, especially if they're not kids who are reading a lot on their own, or kids who go home and English is not spoken much in their household. That's going to make it very difficult for kids to get the kind of experience and exposures that they can really plant the vocabulary knowledge in. So just challenge kids. Go home, find your words outside of school. What we've told them in some studies is, you can find them in a book, on a website, on radio, on TV, in a video game, on a menu. We had kids come in that found the words, their vocabulary words in the Bible. Fantastic. And then you can tally the points as the kids come in. You give them points for doing this. Tally it on a big classroom chart. So it becomes very public and motivating. And we have had measurable effects from this kind of extending vocabulary. In 4th grade, we had something we called Word Wizard, and we told the kids they could hear, see, or use the word outside of school and come in and tell the teacher about it, you'd get points. And the kids really went wild. The teacher was kind of saying like, oh my God, every kid is coming in every day. And we're like, oh, we thought it was fantastic. What we found is that when kids got an opportunity to do that on a set of words, the comprehension effects of learning those words was greater than when they didn't have that opportunity. Then in 6th grade, we called it In the Media, and we told them, find your words anywhere, bring it in. We found a significant positive relationship between the kids who took part in that and their gains from pre to post test on the vocabulary learning measure. And this wasn't just kids who were high achievers doing this, that we really had more of a cross section of kids who participated and then who got the effects. So this afternoon, and I'll keep playing for a few cheap laughs as I finish up, I hope I've given you the idea of how important stealth aspects of vocabulary are, why we need to embed them in teaching and testing, and beyond that, the need to spur kids to mess around with words on their own. Thanks. Oh, did you like them? Thank you. Oops. And I think there will be time for questions, is what I'm told. Mm-hmm.
What about how kids learn grammatical approaches? I noticed in one of your slides something that kills me, referring to a singular object, and then using the plural possessive, like someone and there.
Yeah, see, I would argue with you about that, but I can do that later at the reception. As far as grammatical aspects of language, that's important, and I think it's best done through exposures and through pointing them out, and then when kids use them in an inaccurate way, just reword it, just like you would when kids are first acquiring language, and most effective way is just to reword so that the word is used correctly. I think trying to directly teach grammar can only happen in small doses, and it's very difficult to do it at the same time you're teaching vocabulary. But again, it's making sure that kids get exposed to lots of context so that they're seeing how the word gets used and that it's fixing the words. If they use it, a verb as a noun or something in some other way, then just rephrase it. I think is the most effective way. Mm-hmm.
I had a two-part question. My interest lies in teaching English as a second language or a foreign language. So I was wondering, you talked about how kids need to be exposed to different contexts to to learn one particular word. So is there a way of knowing how many different contexts does a particular word need to be there before moving on to the next word? And then the second question I had was, is there a particular order in which you would teach the words so that it's the most effective way of teaching vocabulary?
Okay, well, let me answer your second question first. No, I don't think there's a particular order. And Andy B. Miller, who I think was here a couple years ago giving this talk, he would argue with me. So if you want to hear an argument of that, get us in the same room. So no, I don't think there is an order. I think that as far as which words do you teach which kids when, our rule of thumb is just that if you can explain the word to a child in terms that are familiar to them, then you can teach that word to them then. So in kindergarten, we've taught, oh gosh, I can't remember the words now. The examples I showed you were from kindergarten. Stunned, distraught, what was the other one? Insist. So those are words that you might see as like a 5th grade word or something. We taught those to kids in kindergarten. So as long as the kids can understand the concept of them. So we often say like, insist. Kids might not know that word, but they know what it is to kind of push on what you want. I mean, they've experienced that. They do that with their parents. So as long as they know the concepts. So as far as the number of encounters, that's just so hard to look at. It's going to be different for different words. The more concrete a word is, the fewer it's going to have. The more squishy a word is, the more ways you use it, it's going to need more contexts. But I wouldn't say that it's before you move on. I would say so. The way that we have usually designed our vocabulary is introduce the word, and the program we've worked with most recently has 2 distinct contexts that we've chosen and developed around an idea. And then we talk about what does that word mean across those 2 contexts, and we do that for several words. And then over the next few days, we'll come back to those words and give more context for them. But then we leave it at the end of a week or so. And then, but the point of all these things that I was showing you, the goofy pictures and all that, is to try to keep the words alive so that kids still are seeing them in different contexts. So it's a very tough question to answer. In our original work, in one of the early studies, we compared 4 encounters with 12 encounters, and we saw that 12 was much more effective than 4. We've gone through and counted, and we've had in one of our early programs, I think we had 16 encounters with most of the words. It's really hard to put a number on it.
If people could please come to the mic, this is being recorded. Thank you so much.
Other questions? You can come up here, Catherine. You can use this mic.
Thanks. Thank you very much. I think what was particularly lovely about this was the summary of the research and then all of the really practical ideas about what to do in classrooms. But let me throw out an alternative hypothesis to see if you can, how far you would be willing to entertain this. A lot of these wonderful classroom techniques are techniques that it could be argued that promote thinking, and the vocabulary comes along sort of for free on the ride, right? If you're asking kids, why do you think that? How would you explain that? That all by itself, with or without interesting vocabulary associated with it, is something that promotes comprehension. And the word wizard mechanism, which I really love, but what is word wizard doing for kids? Well, it's kind of tuning them up to listen carefully to language. And so maybe the mechanism isn't, oh, I found another sentence with my vocabulary word in it. Maybe the mechanism is just, I'm listening more carefully all the time. So I think all maybe it doesn't need a vocabulary piece in order to be effective.
I would argue, and I don't know how far I'd take this, that you want to do both. You do want to have the vocabulary. I mean, if you're going to increase comprehension, vocabulary, I would argue, has to be part of it. because word knowledge has just been shown to be so connected with comprehension and to be the powerful predictor of comprehension. And so I wouldn't want to do just the thinking without the vocabulary piece. But absolutely, it does a lot more than just draw attention to the words. It does push kids to think about language. But I also think it's hard to draw a sharp line from vocabulary instruction to language development. I mean, it's really tied up there together. And what we're doing in our programs, I would argue, is language development. But it is it's sort of grounded in specific words that we work with. And then the part of taking words home in the word wizard, absolutely, the language, the just being aware of and conscious, I think that's, when I'm talking about word worms, that's exactly what I mean. It just keeps going off in my head how to use these words. But I also think, at least for some kids, giving them points for it and having you found distraught, that helps, maybe it even needs to be there for some kids so that they do catch fire. Because there are lots of kids who catch fire automatically about language. And I want to make sure that the ones who don't have that happen automatically have lots of things that I'm pushing on. So yes and no. There's somebody back there. And there's somebody here.
Thank you. Along the lines that we just heard, I think there are also other components that, and you've touched on all of them, that would make, that help students. Oh, you're not, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Just hold it right up here, like you're singing.
Oh, can you hear me now? Oh, good. Okay, thanks. I've got a very loud voice, and so I don't always need them. One of the things, too, that I think helps develop vocabulary, comprehension, metacognition, language is discussion. Mm-hmm. So and what I liked about what you were sharing was that there was discussion involved in almost all of the exercises that you were suggesting for vocabulary. Mm-hmm. And we know that the discussion is very rich, a rich developmental process for students, increasing comprehension as well as obviously increasing vocabulary. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to, but at the same time, I also agree with metacognition, which sometimes we teach as part of comprehension, where we should be. Schema and other components of cognition are also interplay with the vocabulary. Yeah. It's not all isolated. I think that's the point.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the point, that it really is all tied together. There are lots of aspects of language that you need to have in order to use words effectively. And to learn words effectively. We think the discussion, the back and forth interaction, the asking why, having kids explain things is really an important component. Yeah.
But vocabulary is a huge part of that too. So mm-hmm. we don't want to forget that.
Yeah, I think so. There was somebody back there in the second row. Somebody can toss her the microphone. Here we go. Here's Roger.
Oh, thanks, Roger.
I actually just wanted to follow up on Dr. Snow's comment about the fact that you'd be teaching strategies about critical thinking and things like that instead of focusing on vocabulary. And I just think that there's been some recent work done, and even the book like Why Knowledge Matters by Hirsch, about the fact that teaching content-specific knowledge can actually be very useful versus just trying to teach those strategies related to critical thinking or trying to think more about like in the terms of like Common Core and those kinds of standards. So I just kind of, I thought it was an interesting topic to bring up about why the vocabulary and the content-specific knowledge matters versus just trying to teach the children specific strategies for thinking through. So that was all I wanted to
All right,
say.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm an aspiring math teacher, and in my pre-prac today, the word compound came up. And a kid in the class said, like a military compound. And the teacher kind of, like, it's a pre-prac, so I'm observing another teacher, and the teacher kind of froze and wasn't sure which way to go with that.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you if you thought maybe, like, should you encourage those kinds of word associations to build the network, or should you avoid it to avoid, like, confusion?
Well, I think you should, if the student brings it up, I think you should acknowledge it and say at least something. So for something like compound, a military compound, I think that there doesn't seem to be any semantic connection between that kind of compound. So I think I would just say, right, exactly, that there is a military compound, and that's a very different meaning. And then go back to the math one. And then if you felt like what I do if I were a teacher, because it would just bother me, I'd want to go look at the etymological dictionary online and say, well, is there a connection? And if there was, then I would say it the next day, because I know exactly what you mean. The teacher froze, and that I've seen that happen a lot. One of my favorite examples was we have a lot of transcripts of vocabulary lessons, and in this one, the teacher introduced the word nonchalant and asked kids, if they knew it, they didn't, and a student raised his hand and say, well, is that a prefix? Like, is it not chalant? And she went, no, and then moved on. Yes, it is, but just because we don't use the word chalant in our language, and, so I think teachers miss a lot of those opportunities because, and this has to do with the thing I talked about before, they want to open the door and then close it right away. They want to give you all the information on that word instead of saying, oh, that's a really interesting question. I don't think so, because I don't think we have a word chalant. But then, make a mental note of it, look it up, and then share it with kids the next day is what I would say to do. We got a bunch. What happened? Oh, you have it. Oh, go, Sandra.
I've been interested in how teachers can organize a focus on vocabulary over the grades so that there is some sequence to what they're doing, and it's my impression, which could be wrong, that publishers and testers, whatever they've chosen for the reading piece, whatever word is unusual or different gets pulled out, and that's where vocabulary study comes from. So it's very dependent on whatever the publisher has already chosen for the sequence of text. Now, that's the preface to the question about Moffat's approach, which was very different. He was looking at genres. He was interested in developing language and thought, and many of you may be familiar with a textbook that went through 4 editions called A Student-Centered Language Arts Approach. But his idea was to develop language genres in the early grades, palindromes, puns, ditties, little nursery rhymes, things that would pull in vocabulary, but it would be from a more literary perspective so that you would be not zeroing in. I just don't know whether you see any ways of sequencing. He couldn't do more than a sprinkled genre approach. But I don't know if someone's come up with something better.
I don't, and I haven't seen any convincing evidence of that there is a way to organize words so that there's a sequence through the grade levels. I mean, I would say do not use a frequency list to do that. We have to worry about a lot more than frequency. We have to worry about dispersion. You have to look at the words that kids are encountering. So I don't know how to do it. There may be a way to do that, but I don't know, and I'm not sure how important it is, because as long as we're teaching words that are going to be useful for kids, so when the words come out of the text that kids are working with, I think that's a fine approach to take, as long as they're good words, as long as we're not looking at text and going, oh, I don't see anything really good to teach, so how about if I teach jodhpurs? No, don't do that. But as long as you're using texts that do have rich words in them, and then looking at lists like the academic word list, because that is based on words that are actually used across disciplines and across lots and lots of texts. I think that's very useful. But as far as sequencing, I don't know. I don't know how you'd pull it off. No. I think that, you have the microphone. You're next.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you can speak about how successful these strategies have been for particularly lower level English learners, and maybe some additional strategies that you might recommend.
Okay, English learners. We have done, my colleague Amy Crossan, who is a Harvard grad, and I have done some work with English learners and vocabulary. And we have gotten good results. They've learned the words, and I think it's very useful to them to have discussion and interaction going on, because they do get a lot more language input. But I can't say much beyond that. We haven't, the strategies seem to work. The teachers seem to think that they work. Now we're looking at something where we're using these kinds of interactive activities, and we're adding Latin roots to it. So we're deliberately teaching them bound roots from Latin that appear in the words that we're teaching. And we're doing that in two settings. We're doing that in a mostly Spanish-speaking setting, so the kids have some connection with those roots. In fact, we even introduced what we call a Spanish friend, which is not a cognate, but a high-frequency word that has that same root in it. And then we're doing it in a setting where it's mostly not Spanish speakers. It's kids who speak Nepali and African languages and Chinese and Russian, and seeing if does it help kids? Does it help differentially? Are they able to then use the words, to use the roots to work out new words? And we found that they are. We had a study where they were able to make pretty good guesses about words in context using the root. But I can't say anything too specific about what to use and what's if there are strategies within that are more useful. I know that one of the difficulties is you want to give kids lots of context and exposures, but then you have to be really careful about the language you're using within those contexts and whether second language learners are familiar with those. So that was one of our biggest challenges. Yeah.
I'm a fifth grade English teacher, and I teach about 5 words a week, and then assess them usually at the end of the week. So the thing that I was really thinking about throughout the lecture was that the time it takes for that extended mapping, but also finding the balance between, I'm spending a lot of time in this, a lot of time on vocabulary instruction in class. I do need to assess it somewhat regularly to validate the fact that I have this time investment. So what would be, in your opinion, the regularity of which you should assess vocabulary? I was really excited by a lot of the examples that you gave for assessment, but what is the regularity, and how long do kids really need with a word before you assess them on it?
Well, it's a complicated question. I mean, it depends on what you want to assess. If you want to assess just a match between the word and the definition, which is not a terrible thing to do, it might make perfect sense to do it weekly. But then maybe after a couple of weeks, you gather some words together and you give them one of the somewhat more in-depth assessments. Or some of these activities that I showed you can really serve as assessments as well as instruction. So some of them might seem a little more time-consuming, and maybe you don't want to spend the time to use them as assessments. So use them as assessments. So use them in instruction, but then kind of, take the papers, grade them, and then give the kids back, and then have the discussion about them. So it's that kind of thing that can happen. So again, there's not an exact answer to that, and it really is what you want to know. I mean, you might want to know right away at the end of the week, did every kid get at least a definitional idea of what that word means? And so it's not a bad thing to do, but you certainly don't have to. You could wait 2 or 3 weeks and really throw them for a loop. You teach 5 words this week, you teach 5 words the next week, and you test them on these 5 words that week. That'll make them really mad. But it would help illustrate that, we're not just doing this for this week. We're doing that to help you know words.
Hi, my name is Shade Abraham. I'm in the Mind, Brain, and Education program. And thank you so much for sharing your findings. I'm curious about, I was actually writing it down. I'm curious about your thoughts on vocabulary learning in low-income learners who may not have the skills to scaffold their thoughts as much. Kind of going back to the critical thinking conversation, are these students missing crucial critical thinking skills, or are they simply missing like the powerful language needed in the academy?
Whew, that's a complicated question. I think that, it's some of each, but I think the important point is, and you probably know this, that there's nothing wrong with these kids' ability to think, but it may not be as developed as kids who've been challenged in those kinds of ways, and their ability to think around words and around sophisticated words may not be as well developed. So it's that immersing them in language and pushing them to do the thinking. And I think when kids hear other kids giving their views or explaining what they think a word means or whether it fits into a context, that's going to bring them into the discussion. And I think that's what's needed, because the thinking tools are there. You just have to get kids to really put them to use and exercise them. Okay, we're done? Do you want me to do this later?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor McKeown. So now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Professor Jimmy Kim, and he will have the honor of presenting our 2 Chall Awards tonight.
Hi, good afternoon, colleagues. It's a privilege to honor Dr. Patricia Edwards with the Jeanne Chall Visiting Researcher Grant Award. Dr. Edwards is currently a professor of language and literacy in the Department of Teacher Education at Michigan State University. She is a nationally and internationally recognized expert in many fields of literacy research: parent involvement, homeschool community partnerships, multicultural literacy, early literacy, and family intergenerational literacy, especially among low-income and minority children. She served as a member of the International Reading Association's Board of Directors from 1998 to 2001, and in 2006-2007, she was the first African-American president of the Literacy Research Association. Dr. Edwards' research study is titled Bottom Up and Top Down: A Critical Content Analysis of Basel Reading Program's Recommendations for Differentiated and Culturally Responsive Instruction. This is a topic, I think, that builds on Jeanne Chall's research in early literacy instruction and continues her legacy in that area of work. In her 1967 book, Learning to Read: The Great Debate, Jeanne Chall noted that Basel readers, quote, have been and continue to be the most pervasive, enduring, and influential force in American reading instruction. Dr. Edwards builds on this key insight by proposing a study to examine Basel text recommendations for differentiating reading instruction since the enactment of the 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which made equal educational opportunity a national priority. In doing so, she will explore the extent to which Basel texts are culturally responsive for linguistically, ethnically, and diverse student populations, particularly in high-poverty schools. In her proposed research, Dr. Edwards will examine third-grade Basel reading programs published by 3 major reading companies since 1965. And her study will shed light on the shifts in recommendations for differentiation and the broader social and historical context that led to those shifts. In many ways, I think Dr. Edwards' research project continues her illustrious and long-term program of research on the importance of differentiation both for parents and children. In the early 1990s, she created a number of very influential family literacy programs, such as Parents as Partners in Reading, a family literacy training program, and Talking Your Way to Literacy, a program to help non-reading parents prepare their children for reading. These programs are designed to help parents support their children's school and literacy learning. In this line of research, Dr. Edwards coined the term differentiated parenting. I have 3 children, and I can tell you that you have to differentiate your parenting. In short, the concept of differentiated parenting encouraged schools to develop programs that were adapted to fit parents' needs and to capitalize on the diverse strengths of all families. How schools can differentiate programs for parents and instruction for children has been an enduring aim of Dr. Edwards' research program. And these were also central aims, I think, of Jeanne Chall's research. At the end of the book, Learning to Read, The Great Debate, Jeanne Chall's last words were, "Each researcher must try to learn from the work of those who preceded him or her and to add to a unified body of knowledge." Dr. Edwards' project and her many other publications will contribute to a body of knowledge in the field of literacy and enable all schools to pursue excellence with equity. It's my privilege to welcome Dr. Edwards to the podium and to honor her with the Jeanne Chall Visiting Research Grant Award.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I also have the privilege this evening of honoring Dr. Margaret Troyer with the Jeanne Chall Doctoral Student Research Award. Margaret received her doctorate in education from the Harvard Graduate School of Education this spring. Along with Noni Lasso and Catherine Snow, I had the privilege of serving on Margaret's dissertation committee and seeing her research program evolve and flourish during her time here at Harvard. Jeanne Chall's last book was titled The Academic Achievement Challenge: What Really Works in the Classroom. This book reviews nearly 100 years of education research using a variety of methodologies to reach 2 major recommendations. Does anyone know what those recommendations are? Well, here you go. Recommendation 1, there needs to be a greater emphasis on a traditional teacher-centered approach to instruction. And recommendation 2, there needs to be greater awareness of scientific evaluation of research. Margaret's dissertation builds on both of these recommendations. Her dissertation is titled Teacher Implementation of an Adolescent Reading Intervention, but I have to say, Margaret, that I prefer the title that you use in your public presentations, Teaching by the Book, ? Teacher Implementation of an Adolescent Reading Intervention. Margaret's research focuses on a teacher and student-centered approach to helping struggling adolescent readers read for understanding. Her first study finds that the quality of teachers' implementation strongly predicts students' engagement with the curriculum. Her second study shows that teachers' adaptations are the norm rather than the exception during the process of implementation. In both of these studies, Margaret used a wide variety of methods and data sources, like classroom observations, interviews with teachers, student engagement data, to show that implementation of a well-defined reading intervention can still vary dramatically across classrooms. In many ways, Margaret's dissertation research extends the recommendations of the Academic Achievement Challenge. Jeanne Chall made 2 observations at the end of this book. First, she noted that, quote, the distinction between a progressive and traditional approach is never pure. In practice, there are variations within each approach. And second, she noted, quote, we have to give serious consideration to how much practitioners need to know about research. Surely they need to understand enough of it to benefit from it in their practice. Indeed, this is exactly what Margaret's research does. Through close and careful scrutiny of classroom instruction, she sheds light on the factors that lead to variations in teacher practices. And her research is driven by a need to fill gaps in understanding and also to support the work of teachers. Now, this is not surprising at all to those of us who know Margaret, given her extensive experience as a classroom teacher and literacy coach in schools in Baltimore, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. Margaret always viewed teachers as collaborators and colleagues rather than research subjects and participants. And in doing so, her dissertation has served both the scientific community and the community of practitioners. I think Margaret's dissertation is a model of the kind of rigorous and relevant literacy research that Jeanne Chall conducted throughout her career at Harvard. So it is a great privilege for me to welcome Margaret here to the podium and to honor her with the Jeanne Chall Doctoral Student Research Award. Congratulations, Jeanne.